Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our pre-theology introduction to the Bible. And today we are in my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, USA. It's appropriate that we're here to discuss the Persian period because the Persian period is all about how the Jewish people returned from exile and built a new civilization in the ashes of the former one. In the same way, Atlanta, my hometown, had to build from the ashes caused by the Civil War. Let's look at our agenda for today. As we've done in our last two classes, we're going to look first at the historical narrative in the Old Testament that chronicles this time period. Then we're going to look at the poetry and the prophecy that this era inspired. And then finally, we're going to do a retrospective back into the Pentateuch. We're going to do, once again, a retrospective into Israel's history before they were in the land. Let's begin with the books that cover this period in Israel's history. We look especially at the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. You can see here on your screen we have a list of different kings of Persia, and highlighted in blue you've got Cyrus and Darius I. These are going to be the two who are most important for the broader biblical history. King Cyrus is the king of Persia who conquers Babylon, and in 539 is going to allow the exiles to return to their homeland. And he's going to found the Persian satrapy, that is the Persian region of Yehud, from which we get the word Jew or Jewish, and then later the Roman province of Judea. Darius I, who is also highlighted in blue, you can see here is going to be the Persian king when the Second Temple is dedicated. We distinguish between the First Temple and the Second Temple. The First Temple is the one that King Solomon built and was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586. This Second Temple is going to be dedicated in 515 and will survive until AD 70, after the time of Jesus, when it's destroyed by the Romans. Also notice on this chronology the two names highlighted in yellow, Artaxerxes I and Artaxerxes II. We know that Ezra is set during a period of a king Artaxerxes. Traditionally, we assume that Ezra came before Nehemiah, but some scholars argue that Ezra would have come later, so you can see the two options are presented here before you. Let's just consider the geography and the broader chronology for a moment. This map chronicles how the Jewish exiles would have returned to their homeland. You can see Judea is highlighted on the map, translated. That's the Persian satrapy of Yehud I was referring to earlier. You can see just to the north, there's a Persian satrapy called Beyond the River. The river in question is the Euphrates. That's going to be alluded to in the book of Ezra. Also, just so that we're clear on the chronology, starting in 538 or 539, depending upon which timeline you're looking at, the exiles begin to return under King Cyrus. That Second Temple's construction is going to begin in 520 and is going to be dedicated in 515. Later on, Nehemiah is going to move to Jerusalem to rebuild the city walls, and then the Persian period comes to a close in 332 BC when Alexander the Great, the king of the Greeks, conquers the Persians. Let's look and see what Ezra and Nehemiah have to say about this era. Ezra begins, "Thus says Cyrus, those among you who belong to any part of his people, may their God be with them. Let them go up to Jerusalem in Judah to build the house of the Lord, the God of Israel, that is, the God who is in Jerusalem." We're going to notice during this post-exilic period, that is, this period after the Babylonian exile, the temple is going to have a new and more stressed meaning. And indeed, the role of priests is going to be much greater than it was before. Why? Because there's no Davidic king. Moreover, prophets, while we're going to see there are some prophets, we don't have nearly the prophetic legacy we seem to have had before the exile. Interestingly, though, while Ezra and Nehemiah take a very priestly perspective, Ezra himself is a priest, there is another figure that merits mention, and that is the figure of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, according to the chronicler, is a successor of David. And this is notable. You can see the text of 1 Chronicles on your screen. This is notable because Matthew chapter 1 is going to cite this passage in constructing Jesus' own genealogy, in which Zerubbabel is a forefather. So Jesus is going to continue along this same line of David into which Zerubbabel is a part. One of the theological points, besides the importance of the temple and that of priests, is that Ezra and Nehemiah are the two most exclusivist books of the Old Testament. That is, they're strongest on Israelite identity. That is, God has chosen the Israelites and has not chosen the other nations. Therefore, the people of God are to shun the surrounding nations. Ezra and Nehemiah go so far as to say, if you are married to a foreigner, get divorced and abandon the children. Here's what Ezra says. Let us therefore enter into a covenant before our God to dismiss all our foreign wives and the children born of them. in keeping with what you, my Lord, advise, and those who are in dread of the commandments of our God. We'll see Isaiah has a different role envisioned for the foreigners. But that brings us now to the prophets. And we look at Isaiah, and especially the second half of Isaiah, which is set during this period of the exile and the period shortly after the exile. You can see here in Isaiah 44, Cyrus is mentioned by name. You see he's called my shepherd and indeed anointed. That word for anointed is Messiah. So notice that word Messiah is a little bit flexible here. Indeed, this latter part of Isaiah seems crafted to convince skeptical Jews to believe that God is working through this foreign king Cyrus. Look at what it says further. For the sake of Jacob my servant, of Israel my chosen one, I have called you by name. The you is Cyrus. Given you a title, though you do not know me. Cyrus doesn't know the Lord of Israel. I am the Lord, there is no other, there is no God besides me. Note the monotheism here. It is I who arm you, though you do not know me, so that all may know from the rising of the sun to its setting that there is none besides me. I am the Lord, there is no other. This is a beloved passage, and it points to how God is working through King Cyrus. As we look at the other prophets from this period, you'll notice in our pigeonholes we've got Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. All of them, consistent with Ezra and Nehemiah, touch on the importance of the Second Temple. Indeed, Haggai is the rare prophet who asks for something, gets what he wants, and is happy about it. Haggai tells Israel in his brief 2-chapter book to build that Second Temple. And they do it, and he's happy about it. We will see that Jonah is another prophet who gets what he wants, but he's unhappy about it. Indeed, Jonah wants to commit suicide when God gives him what he preached for. But that's another story for another day. Let's look also at the Pentateuch. We've looked already at Genesis and Deuteronomy. Let's look at the middle 3 books, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. The first half of Exodus is famous because it chronicles the story of how the Israelite slaves were led out by the Lord out of the land of Egypt, eventually into Sinai, where they received the law. Then in Exodus 25, the book becomes, by a lot of people's estimations, more boring because it starts giving painstaking detail about how the tabernacle was to be constructed. It gets spiced up a little bit more when Israel starts worshiping a golden calf, but the rest of the book of Exodus kind of ends, in a lot of people's estimations, with a whimper. Similarly, Leviticus and Numbers are not known for being stimulating reading, but think of their importance after the exile. To be sure, the Exodus traditions are most ancient. We can tell just by looking at the style of Hebrew in Exodus 15. It's archaic. We can also look especially to the book of Hosea, which we know was written in the 8th century, which alludes to the Exodus traditions. But that having been said, the old story of the Exodus adds meaning in the post-exilic period. We see, especially in Isaiah 43, the prophet alludes to the Exodus as if to say, what God once did in Egypt, he now does here in Babylon. He leads you out just as he once led those slaves out back to the land. The story is repeating itself. And the most important moment in the entire book of Exodus is here in Exodus 12, where the slaves of Pharaoh become the servants of the Lord. That's the same word in Hebrew. You can see in the blue, that's the same word, eved or avad is the verb. The Hebrew people go from serving Pharaoh to serving the Lord. This is crucial context for everything the New Testament has to say about how to serve the Lord. Last point, as we look at the book of Leviticus, a book that is famous for being boring, I would suggest that common reading is not a good reading. After all, in the tradition that led rise to the canon, therefore, according to divine inspiration, this book is the centerpiece of the whole Pentateuch. Israel is called to be holy as the Lord their God is holy. You can see right here in Leviticus 19. Here we are in the middle of the Pentateuch, and it's all about how this people is to be set apart and holy, and the New Testament authors are going to seize on this when they talk about how Christians are called to live their lives, and we will jump to that in a few classes. Until that time, read well and pray well.